we'll get started. And unfortunately, Rabbi Evan actually has a funeral today, so he won't be able to pipe up during our conversation today. But we are recording, and so he'll have a chance to watch afterwards. So if he has reflections, he'll bring them next week when it's his turn to talk about chapters 5 and 6 in a letter in the scroll. I'm going to try and get us through chapters 3 and 4 today, which is actually there's a lot going on in these chapters. So so we'll dive into that in just a minute. Um, you know, Lord Sachs wrote many books. This one, A Letter in the Scroll, is probably the first one that really made an impact around the Jewish world. You know, outside of the United Kingdom and into America and in Israel as well. And after that, many of his other books had an equal or even greater impact, and some of them reached well beyond the Jewish world into the religious world in general. For instance, his book *The Dignity of Difference*, which comes a few years after this book, was very well read in not just in Jewish circles, but in religious circles all across the country. I actually spoke at a mosque in Libertyville on a panel relating to Rabbi Sachs's book, *The Dignity of Difference*, a number of years ago. So, so this book is a little more insular in the Jewish community. It certainly has things that others can read about, but his primary focus, as he talks about in the early chapters, is about why Judaism should persist, why be Jewish. And he answers that throughout the book in a number of different ways. It's pretty elegantly organized, I think you'll find as you go through it. Um, and he moves back and forth from his own personal experience to a more generalized kind of experience of the Jewish community. So in chapter 3, he begins by speaking about his own experience growing up in a modern Orthodox household in England, um, doing what a lot of us did in our own way in our own religious communities, you know, going to Hebrew school in the afternoons after he went to his secular school, going to services with his father, having a bar mitzvah, these sorts of things, and then going on to study at Cambridge, where he delves into modern philosophy and has a very different experience of the world. And you know, he talks about some of the writers that he read when he was in Cambridge. A.J. Ayres, who he says in the space of 20 minutes, 20 pages rather, dismissed the whole of metaphysics, morals, and religion as meaningless. Right. And so this was the world, this was his milieu, was this idea um, of the modern philosophical tradition, right? Um, Moral judgments were expressions of subjective emotion, not objective truths. Right? So very much not a religious perspective. And then the Six-Day War comes along. So in May of 1967, and then of course the war starting in June, he talks about this experience of being at Cambridge during the time that happens. And it's a very personal experience. Um, that all of a sudden uh, Jews at Cambridge started coming together to listen to the radio news, to hear what was going on the borders of the state of Israel in those days. Um, he writes that it meant that they felt part of a people involved in its fate, implicated in its destiny, caught up in its tragedy, exhilarated by its survival. I had felt it. So had every other Jew I knew. And I think perhaps more as important to that is, you know, he says every Jew I knew. All of a sudden, he knew that there were a lot more Jews at Cambridge than he had any idea were there, right? That this was a moment when people kind of came out of the woodwork, so to speak, and sort of to express this feeling about what was going on. And looking around our group, I mean, I know that there are a lot of folks on this call who actually may have memories from those days of 1967. I thought might be nice for us to share a little bit, whether we have a similar experience to Rabbi Sachs or a different one. So if you can think back to those days, I mean, for me, remember my older brothers who were both vehemently opposed to the war in Vietnam in those days and were old enough for the draft in America, getting ready to get on planes and go to Israel to help. So so I was a little too young for that. But anyway, I see a couple of hands up. So I think I see Alice, and maybe if there's others
Yeah.
you can help. So
Well, I was going to say I was 18 in 1967, and I had planned with my parents. We were supposed to go to Israel in June. I think our trip was at the end of June. It was a tour, and it got canceled. I mean, it got canceled as soon as, you know, as soon as the war broke out. But then I went to Israel on my own with Histadrut, which was the labor group in Israel the next year. So I was in Israel the year after the war, and it was just, it was, I mean, I had never been to Israel before, so I don't know how it was different, but it was very, I mean, just, there was such pride and such just strong feelings of, you know, nationalism, and how, this small country, prevailed. And it was, I just remember singing Jerusalem of Gold every day almost. It was just, it was a very striking, impactful experience being there the year after the war.
yeah, Jerusalem of Gold was a new song in those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was written, I think, just before the war, but it really got its popularity during that time.
Yeah, yeah,
Really quite a remarkable piece
yeah,
of music by Naomi Shemer.
yeah.
There is actually an alternative version of that was written by a soldier who becomes an Israeli musician in his own right over the years. But his first song was actually a alternative lyrics to Jerusalem of Gold called Jerusalem of Iron, which talked about the difficulty of being a soldier and of fighting in this war. So, other thoughts? Yeah, I see Abby. You have to unmute. Yeah.
My experience was almost a corollary to Alice's. I was supposed to and hoped to go to Israel in 67. I had just graduated from college, and there was a travel ban, and my plans fell apart. But I was also supposed to and did visit the two other only remaining relatives on my father's side who um, survived the Holocaust, who were living in Vienna. And I, as a graduate of a Jewish day school and Hebrew high school and a very intense Jewish background, I was startled to see all the anti Semitic slogans on the train stations and all the public transportation in Vienna. I had no idea, no way of handling this. I was totally unprepared. And even the questioning of my relatives who could not understand my pride in being a Jew, it was just one of the most emotional, devastating, difficult experiences for me. But the one highlight was on the way back with one of my younger cousins. Spent a few days in Paris, and at the Paris Orchestra Hall was the first time that I also heard Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. So that was, the tears just didn't stop. But the rest of the experience was just so emotional that I'm still having difficulty understanding where they were coming from or where I am. And that's why just reading the first few chapters of this book, I'm finding somewhat therapeutic.
Yeah, it's interesting, but you were already, in a sense, ahead of where Rabbi Sachs was in that moment, right? I mean, he was
a little bit older, a few years older, probably. I was 16.
he was waking up at Cambridge to this idea that he was really part of the Jewish people, rather than just sort of going through life, Yeah, he was Jewish. I mean, he was, he grew up in an Orthodox home doing the Jewish things that he was expected to do, but he didn't necessarily have that sense of peoplehood just yet. Fascinating. See a couple other hands. Susan Wellick?
Uh, yeah, well, this is just a little bit different than what everybody else is talking about. Seeing as I'm a bit older than those who have spoken, um, I was living near Cambridge in the early 60s when my husband was an officer in the Air Force and stationed there. And we were living in a small town near Cambridge. And the landlady of the 500-year-old place that we lived in came over and was looking at my wedding album. And she said, "What's that thing he has on his head?" I explained to her that we were Jewish and he was wearing a yarmulke. And she said, "Oh," and meaning a Jew, she said, "I've never seen one of those before," meaning she had never seen a Jew before.
Yes.
So I was the first Jewish person that this woman and my husband, the first Jewish people she had ever met in her life. And this was a woman at that time, had to be in at least her 50s. And she was like totally unaware of us. And that's what I find interesting about Rabbi Sacks' experience at Cambridge in 1967, I guess, that there were so many Jews because we lived so close to Cambridge.
Right.
And here's a woman who had never seen a Jew before.
Right.
So I found that really interesting.
And I would guess arguably that she had seen Jews before. She had no idea that she had seen Jews before, right? And that was kind of Rabbi Sacks' experience as well, is, he knew he was a Jew at Cambridge, and each individual probably knew that he or she was a Jew in that time and in that place. But it took this moment, right? This catalyzing moment of the, coming up to the 6-Day War for these folks to come out and come together and express some kind of peoplehood together. Is there anyone else who's dying to get in on that before we go on a little bit? I can't see any other hands, so let's.
It's Gersh.
Oh, thanks.
You missed my hand.
Yeah.
I was young, working in New York City, lived in northern New Jersey. My wife and I had recently joined a synagogue in northern New Jersey. And as soon as the war started, there was a call for us all to go to the synagogue. And it ended up being a money-raising event. And I think I gave more money than I should have at that point. Young guy trying to make a way. And can't recall whether I had any children at that point or not, but it was a meaningful experience where the whole community, this was in northern New Jersey, with a good number of Jewish communities in that area. And it certainly in the synagogue that I belong to, people stepped up.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that was a big sea change actually in the reform movement in America. So there was the 6-Day War in terms of support for Israel. I mean, that had been in some places a controversial position to take, a pro-Israel position. The reform movement officially in the early 1900s had not been pro-Zionist. But the 1967 war was a real watershed in terms of that. And a lot of congregations, a lot of Reform congregations for the first time in their history actually did fundraisers, Israel bond drives and things like that they had avoided up until that moment. So again, some of the things that I think Rabbi Sacks describes of a community showing up and coming together is something that happened all across the Jewish world, right? People who had, in some cases, kind of carefully concealed who they were, came out kind of in force in this moment. And so there were fundraising efforts. I remember lines of young people getting ready to go and volunteer, in Israel. The congregation I grew up in, which was a Reformed congregation in Miami, had its first trip to Israel as a community as a result of the Six-Day War, right? So they had never bothered to organize such a trip until that moment. And so you can see some of the things that happen here. And what Rabbi Sacks makes a point of saying is that this gathering of people, this outpouring of community that shows up at the start of the Six-Day War goes against most of the things that he had been studying in secular philosophy, right? That all of a sudden, being part of a people became important again. It didn't make sense in the philosophical milieu of the 1960s, but it makes sense in the language of Jewish tradition. And he points to a line that's pretty famous from the Talmud that is Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. And so there is this sense of Jewish community that comes out of this very personal moment of 1967 for him. And we'll talk about how he takes the personal and now moves it into a more general kind of argument. So he has a very personal experience that he says, this shows to me that there is a place for us in the Jewish community, that there is a link that binds Jews to one another. And he wants to examine what that is, and now sort of taking a step back from his personal experience, sort of see how is this different than the experience of other people's other faiths, and which will help him answer his original question, which is what he's going to keep coming back to throughout the book, is why be Jewish? As I said last week for a moment that, we have a lot of books in our tradition about how to be Jewish, a lot of books about what we're supposed to do. And, of course, every detail of keeping kosher and all these kinds of things, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to do it. But that question of why continue this tradition is one that's a little more elusive, and it doesn't get asked all that often. As he said last week, 4 events in Jewish history cause us to ask this kind of question, the most recent one for him being the Shoah, the Holocaust and its aftermath. But one of the things he then points to in the book is how other cultures put their faith into places and things, into palaces. He talks about a documentary that he watched about ancient Egypt and the pyramids and the temples at Luxor and Karnak and Abu Simbel and places like that. And in Judaism instead, where the stones remained and the culture is gone, Judaism doesn't have the stones so much, but the culture remained. And he sees that as a key importance in the survival of Jewish tradition and in this creation of a Jewish community, right? I would argue that we actually tried it the way of the Egyptians. That's a little different than the way Rabbi Sacks words it here, I think, right? I think we made our attempt at building a lasting temple that would be there for all eternity, right? But that temple was destroyed. And so that way failed, in a sense, and the Jewish tradition embraces something different at that point. It's what allows, we talk about in the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who writes this incredibly wonderful little book about the Sabbath, called The Sabbath, where he talks about the Sabbath being a palace in time, right? That rather than focusing on a building, an actual building somewhere, that Judaism focuses on a moment in time and makes of that a palace, right? So this may be, in some sense, an accident of history, right? If the temple in Jerusalem had survived after the insurrection against Rome in the year 70, what might Judaism be today, right? Might be very different. So in some sense, I do think, I don't think Rabbi Sachs would agree with me. He would not say that this is an accident of history, right? I mean, I think he would understand it. And certainly there's plenty of Jewish traditional underpinning to this, that this happened for a reason, right? The destruction of the temple that allows this development of Judaism to happen. I think I saw a hand. Was that Sarah? Yeah.
The transition from the priestly Judaism to the rabbinic Judaism to have a portable religion in the diaspora was very powerful. And I think a lot of our traditions can be viewed as structuring time in meaningful ways. Not only the Sabbath, but the other festivals and many elements of Judaism give meaning to time throughout the year. And that's very powerful.
Yes, and I think that's part of Heschel's argument when he talks about the Sabbath, right? Is that, unlike some other traditions that organize around place, we organize around time, right? What time is the right time to light the candles? What time is the right time to say the Shema? All of these things become very important in rabbinic Judaism, and whole vast sections of Talmud are devoted to these things. Very little time is devoted to how you should build a sanctuary, right? There are very few rules in rabbinic Judaism. And the only one I can, well, maybe two that I can think of. One is facing toward Jerusalem in prayer. Although there's debate about that in the Talmud, it's not a settled point of Talmudic law. In fact, the Talmud gives us examples of rabbis who faced in all different directions. Rabbi Akiba, who seemed to wander around the room when he was in prayer. They would leave him facing in one direction and come back finding him facing another direction, right? This is illustrated in Talmud. And it's clear, by the way, that the point is to face Jerusalem, and remember, sometimes I kind of joke about this. It also comes from a time when people thought the world was flat. So the only way to face Jerusalem was to turn in and, if you were in Europe, it was to turn and face east, right? Face Jerusalem. Once you know that the world is round, every direction you face eventually gets you to Jerusalem. Some are shorter than others, there's short paths and long paths, but any direction is the right direction for prayer, if you think about it that way. But it's also true that even in Jerusalem, depending on where you are in the city, you face toward the Temple Mount, right? So it's different, in different parts of the world. So. And the other thing that it tells us is that a place of worship should have some natural light. Those are the only things I can think of, actually, in terms of the rules about building a sanctuary. There are far more rules about when to say certain prayers, right? And so time is much more important than space when it comes to these things. So. So he writes that the Jewish people through time constitute a story, the strangest and most moving story in the annals of mankind. I think that's a lovely sentence, but I'd like to push back on it a little bit. But I saw a hand. So Lynn, do you want to unmute?
You made a great transition for me because this was to me the most meaningful part of the readings. The idea that each person is a letter. This idea of hit me today in reading about why be a Jew, and this idea of a sense of belonging to a group really struck me as a way to communicate to young people what Judaism means to them. Because if they're a letter and the letter becomes, and they're important in the sense of being part of the sentence, and the sentence is part of a paragraph, and the paragraph is part of a story, and you are a story. I mean, what wonderful metaphor would that be in education for little kids to know that they're essential in the grand scheme of writing a story and knowing about their history. So as an educator, I thought that was a beautiful metaphor, and it made me realize that probably my attraction to Judaism was, instead of these temples, he said, we don't put our emphasis on temples, we put our buildings, we put our emphasis on words, words and deeds. And so all of that together spoke to me today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really powerful metaphor, and there's a reason why I think when the book was released in America, they changed the title to this title. It was called something else in its first pressing. Rabbi Evan mentioned it last week. I can't remember what it was, but when it was published in America, they took this title from the title of one of the chapters that we're looking at today. Chapter 4 is called A Letter in the Scroll, and making that the overall name of the book. I mean, I think it is a very powerful metaphor, right? Not one that that Rabbi Sacks invented, but he elucidates it so beautifully, I think, here in chapter 4, right? But it does come from an older Jewish tradition, this idea that each of us is a letter in the scroll. He attributes it to the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. So I think that's 16th century, maybe 17th.
Rabbi, that's
18th.
18th. It's Maryland. It's 18th.
18th century, right? So,
Um,
yeah, so a really beautiful metaphor. Marilyn, did you want to say something else?
yeah. I wanted to say I can't remember what part of Torah it was when we studied. It says in Torah, in one of the chapters, that we should write our own Torah. Where is that, Rabbi? And
I can't give you the exact citation, but it's in Devarim, I think, in Deuteronomy,
okay.
where it talks about that. Now later on in Talmudic literature, they make this more of a what would I say? They give some bones to that mitzvah, right? So it becomes a mitzvah in Talmud, to commission the writing of a Torah scroll, right? So and people who can afford to do such a thing, I mean, it becomes a very special philanthropic effort to be able to do that. But going back to Devarim, it talks about it. I mean, it's sort of in the law for the king, that the king must have a copy of the Torah at the side of the throne for consultation when issues come up, and that we should write this text. Some debate about whether it means just the book of Devarim or whether it means the whole Torah. But in either case, I mean, it sort of comes down to us as one of the mitzvot, is to be engaged in writing a Torah. And if you're ever lucky enough to be in a place where a Torah scroll gets created, one of the things, we have a scroll building that's probably I think it's the newest scroll that we have, is one that was commissioned at Lakeside Congregation, and the scribe actually came to the building, and the last chapter was left unfinished. so that members of the congregation could come up and with the guiding hand of the scribe, finish writing the last letters.
Oh,
of
how
the-
beautiful.
Yeah, and that's a common thing when scrolls are commissioned, for in order to fulfill that mitzvah that you're talking about, right? In a certain sense, if I guess if our responsibility is to write the scroll, then like being a letter in the scroll, every stroke of each and every letter is writing the Torah. So having people come up to the bima and finish the scroll,
How special.
yeah, it's a very special sort of living out of this metaphor of being a letter in the scroll and what that might mean.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
last week at the end of the session, I brought up the point that I remember hearing on a podcast. I believe it was that Rabbi Sachs tells the story that when he was searching to find himself from this philosophical education that he was pursuing, he decided he didn't have a whole lot of money, but he found the funds to find transportation and buses, and he went on to New York, to the East Side, and he showed up at the Rebbe's door, and they asked him if he had an appointment, and he said, "No, I just came." And they said, "Well, you don't understand. People wait 6 months sometimes to have a meeting with the Rebbe." So he says, "Okay, I'll hang around. And when there's an opening, I would love to be seen." So eventually, he hung around New York, and he said he was a poor student. He didn't have very much funds, but he was determined. And so he hung around. They called him and they said to him, "Okay, there's an opening for you. You can come in now and visit with the Rebbe." And the Rebbe asked him a lot of these questions that he's asking and teaching us, wanting to know what he was pursuing and what his thoughts were and what was it that he was doing for his life, what was he pursuing, and how was he going to change the world. And I wasn't there, but I'm just saying this is the general kind of questions he was asked, I'm sure. And so he was profoundly touched by it. And at the end of the story, it's told by other rabbis that he wrote to the Rebbe and said, "Okay, I was offered," and the Rebbe alluded to him that he should be a rabbi. And so he wasn't thinking about being a rabbi, he was studying philosophy, but he did, as we know. And then in the end, he wrote the Rebbe and said, "I was given a pulpit. Should I take that pulpit?" And then I told you last week, the Rebbe answered back with a letter crossing out the I and the should. And he let him answer his own question.
Right.
And so the rest is history, and what a blessing it's been for us all.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I think it's really important to remember Rabbi Sachs in his context too, right? So he tells us about his time studying in Cambridge, and so we have to understand that he is a modern Jew living in the called the milieu of the secular world, or the Christian world for that matter, right? And that's where he comes from. Rabbi Evan mentioned last week that he had some issues at times negotiating this place as the chief rabbi between the more the Hasidic community, the ultra-Orthodox community on the one hand, and the Reform and the liberal community on the other hand. Rabbi Evans said that he struggled with a sense of inferiority, not having grown up in the milieu of more traditional Orthodoxy than the one he grew up in. I think that that's a fair thing to say about him, and that he also had some you know, he did some things as we talked about with the funeral of Hugo Grinn last week that made him not so welcome in the reform and liberal community. But I think we have to look at him in his milieu, you know, and it's an interesting, you know, he's uniquely suited in a sense to do what he did. And that's where I would go with that about his biography and his life, right? I mean, we read the stories of Moses in the Torah these weeks, and we talk about Moses being raised in Pharaoh's palace and becoming the one who speaks to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." That there is really nobody else but Moses who could do that, who could go between these worlds, in a sense. And that's one of the interesting things to me about the work of Rabbi Sacks, is that he still lives in both of these worlds. Even when he's writing this book and he's talking about peoplehood and this connection, he keeps bringing, look at the people he quotes, the folks who, to bring this issue out about how special Judaism is, right? He brings Blaise Pascal and Leo Tolstoy and Nikolai Berdyaev, right? You're not very likely to find someone in the ultra-Orthodox world writing about the peoplehood of Israel and bring up Leo Tolstoy, right? That's the beauty of the milieu that Rabbi Sacks comes out of. And if you only write, you can write books that are only for the ultra-Orthodox and only they will read them and only they will understand them, right? Or you can write books that are totally in the modern philosophical milieu that, metaphysics is not real and dismiss it, right? And Rabbi Sacks is this bridge between two worlds, right? As Moses is a bridge between two worlds. And that's a unique place to be. And there are not that many scholars who have been able to write within that kind of milieu. And that's one of the things that I think makes him very special. Whether, we shouldn't forget the fact that he's only human and that he made some mistakes in his life, some of which he owned up to and some of which he didn't. But his ability to speak to these two worlds is really something very special. And that's what makes it worth looking at his work, I think. I want to get back to the text a little bit. I mentioned that near the beginning, I believe, of, I didn't write down the page for this, but I think it's near the beginning of chapter 4. It says, the Jewish people through time constitute a story, the strangest and most moving story in the annals of mankind. And that's a really powerful sentence, a really beautiful sentence. And I think that many Jews can relate to that sentence. But I do want to push back on it just a little bit. We do have a tendency to place ourselves in the center of our own world, right? Which makes sense, right? We do have a tendency to say, I'm the star of my own movie, right? Nobody wants to play a bit part in the movie of their own life, right? You want a starring role. Okay? So when we write about the Jewish community and say it's the strangest and most moving story in the annals of mankind, that's a pretty, pretty big claim, right? And I would think that there would be some peoples of other faiths and other traditions who might want to challenge that claim. And there are certainly plenty of people who over the generations would also say that they have the most moving story in the annals of mankind, right? And so if we look at that phrase objectively, we should ask ourselves what other faiths might say about it. What, for example, would a Native American say? To give just one small example, right, of the fact that despite everything that's happened to them, their tribe still exists. um, they have a pretty powerful claim on having a moving story. Um, so I think over time, Rabbi Sachs, so by the time he writes a book that comes out several years later that I mentioned earlier, The Dignity of Difference, he probably wouldn't write this sentence in quite the same way that he does here. But as I said, I think that on the surface, we relate to it, right? Because we as Jews relate to this. We have an incredible story. It is strange. It is moving, right? Not the only one, but a very powerful story that calls to us. So I think he's on a little firmer ground when he talks about the Jewish community in terms of the letter in the scroll. I mean, I think that speaks to us a little bit more. And he mentions that, there are rules about Torah scrolls, right? A Torah scroll, that over time, letters fade and things happen. I mean, it's why we occasionally bring in a scribe to look at the scrolls, to assess them, to make sure that they're still in good shape. Because if a letter disappears from a scroll, from a Torah, the scroll is invalid. It's not kosher anymore. If too many letters, right? If one letter disappears, you bring in a scribe and fix it, right? If a few letters happen, if something needs patching, you can actually fix a scroll, you can repair it. But if too many letters fall out of a scroll, the only thing you can do with it is bury it, right? If it gets beyond a point of repair. So if too many people fall out, right, disappear from the Jewish community, then the scroll that we create together doesn't exist. We can survive rewriting a letter here and there, but if too many fall out, what can we do? I saw a hand, I see a couple actually. Let me get Merle, because you haven't spoken.
Yes, there was a really remarkable book written in 1995 called Material World by Peter Menzel. And he sent photographers to 30 countries. And the people who lived in houses or apartments took their possessions and put them outside the house, everything. So then they were asked, what is your most important possession? And when they got to the Israeli family and they said to them, what is your most important possession? They said, we don't care at all about our possessions. They could all be gone. The only thing that's important here is the people. We care about our people.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very moving because that was the only family in this whole book of 30 families that said that.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of what the Jewish people is about. It's about caring about the people.
It's lovely, right? And it's a corollary to what we were talking about earlier about, making a palace in time rather than space. So it's not about the things, it's not about the buildings. It's not about the things in the buildings. It's about the people who come in and out of the building, right? That's what's important. And so family, the people in the family, but community, these things. Now, it happens, as you say in this case, that they were the only ones who would say that. Depends on who you ask, right? So I think that there is a spirituality that transcends any parochial faith that would go to a place like that, right? But there's no doubt that we have a story, and we have a story that's worth telling. So that we're a metaphor that I've used in sermons on occasion, and talk about extinction, right? What the world loses when any creature becomes extinct, right? Something is lost and something is broken when any species becomes extinct. The same would be true of any faith, right? And if it's like losing like losing an animal to extinction, right? You may not immediately see what what it does to the cycle of life, but it irreparably harms and changes the environment, right? And so those are the stakes of losing any tradition, right? Jewish tradition is one of them, but really any faith tradition that becomes extinct would be a profound change to the world. So we obviously have a particular view of this, right, and a particular desire to make sure that our faith continues to exist. But I think that we're also broad-minded enough to say that this would, we don't want to see any faith become extinct, right? And there are probably some that are in far more danger than we are, actually. Lynn, you had something, and a couple of hands here.
At the end of, I'm going way back to chapter 1 because I reread this, and I'm speaking to your point when he says at the end of chapter 1, so when in the past Jews asked why they should continue to be Jewish, what was the answer? At the beginning of that paragraph, he talks about Judaism as a religion of continuity, and it depends for its very existence on the willingness of successive generations to hand on their faith and way of life to their children, and the loyalty of children to the heritage of their past. And I'm feeling here that this is based on a huge assumption, and I think we need to examine this if this is his thesis. This is an assumption that people are loyal. And my question is, where is loyalty today? In all aspects of life, Gary and I have talked about this in baseball teams or political endeavors or whatever. What has become of loyalty? And is this assumption, which isn't based on fact to me, it's based on emotion. How do we get our people not to leave the religion based on loyalty to passing on our heritage to the next generation?
Right. It's a very interesting question. And I think that, Sachs perhaps is at his best when he talks about these things in the most personal of ways, when he talks about his own life and how his experience affects his life. When he tries to draw it out into the larger Jewish world, there's such a variety of experience that sometimes that gets a little more difficult. So for him, he sees that as his call, right? That, his loyalty, his devotion to passing it on from one generation to the next, his children's willingness to accept that and pass it on. The experience of the 6-Day War that he mentions here is seminal in his life in awakening that kind of loyalty. And I think the question you're asking, Lynn, is now, a generation or two after the 6-Day War, with young people who have grown up not with an Israel that appears fragile and always on the cusp of being destroyed by outside forces. We now have an Israel that is powerful and, has more to worry about from its own internal divisions than it does from external enemies at the moment, right? If the 6-Day War is what engendered Rabbi Sachs's connection to Jewish community, what would have happened if that didn't come along? Would he have found something else that gave him this understanding? Perhaps he was the kind of person who would have found that meaning somewhere else. But to ask other people in our present day situation to have exactly the same experience that he had of peoplehood, it doesn't work that way. Now, at the same time, we saw, 2 years ago when it's been 2 years since the synagogue in Pittsburgh was attacked, right? We saw what a profound experience that was in the American Jewish community. Um, so other things besides the Six-Day War, some positive, some negative, may have this kind of effect on people. And on some level, we have Jewish educators have the responsibility of trying to point out those seminal moments uh, where we can find them and help people find their way to that kind of loyalty and connection that we pass on from generation to generation. Because just saying Ve'ahavta isn't going to do it, right? I mean, the Ve'ahavta talks about, you shall teach it to your children and say it as you walk on the way and all of those things. But just that prayer alone is not going to make that connection. We have to do much more to make that connection. And I think that, to his credit, I mean, that's what Rabbi Sacks is telling us is, yes, this is how Judaism has survived all these years. How are we going to make it happen? Right. And that for me is the interesting thing. We'll start to sum up here, these two chapters, right? He mentions Moses, right? That Moses has a choice between living in Pharaoh's palace or becoming the one who frees the Israelite slaves, right? And and we also have that choice. We have a choice like Moses did, a choice between luxury and history, a choice between say, I am comfortable and I don't really have to let anybody know who I am, what my faith is, right? I'm, not be a part of tradition. And one of the things that he is most worried about is that that's exactly what's happening, right? That in the modern milieu, where we're no longer told by outside forces that we're Jews, right? Certainly not as much as used to be the case, where we can pass into society and not let anyone know, similar to what Sue was saying about the folks she knew around Cambridge back in those days. There were, as Rabbi Sacks tells us, there were Jews there. They just didn't necessarily go around making it clear to anybody else that they were Jews, right? Until this moment came upon them, That's the choice that we have. That's the kind of modern dilemma, he talks about Immanuel Kant putting autonomy at the heart of moral life, right? And this is very important. It's very important in modern thought and certainly in modern religious thought. I mean, it's, what Kant distillizes when he writes about this is at the heart of, it's at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, right? That every Protestant, every Christian should read the Bible for him or herself and interpret it him or herself and make decisions on what their behavior should be based on his or her individual interpretation, right? This is autonomy. And the other side of autonomy is authority, a God who commands and says, this is what you should do in order to be holy. And Reform Judaism in particular is born in the wrestling match between authority and autonomy, right? That each of us has the ability to decide for ourselves what is meaningful in Judaism and do what we find personally meaningful. Sacks would not accept that as an understanding of how Judaism should be practiced, right? That's too much autonomy from his point of view. What Judaism requires from his point of view is some authority, right? A commanding God, right? He reads the Torah as history. That, when he sees that documentary about the great buildings of ancient Egypt, he says, my ancestors built some of those. Right? Now, actually, I think historically those buildings are considerably older than any historicity of Jews being slaves in Egypt. But he starts from this place of God as commander, right? Which is not a real comfortable place for Reform Judaism. And it's part of his struggle with reformers, I think, that we hold to Kant's view of personal autonomy too strongly. Reform looks to a balance of those things, authority and autonomy. You know, and I think we can relate very well to some of the things that Jonathan Sacks says here in this chapter, in this book. But we still would argue that we have, that modern culture requires us to make choices about authority and autonomy. So when he says, for instance, that each of us has significance precisely insofar as we are part of a story. We are not free-floating atoms in infinite space. We are letters in the scroll, right? I think we can really relate to that as modern Reform Jews. I mean, I know I do. I mean, I relate to that idea, right? But it does at its heart suggest that we are not completely free to reject everything, right? That there is an authority in the universe. So, so I think that this book is at its best when it's at its most personal, right? I mean, that's when it really connects for me. When Rabbi Sacks says, I think right near the end of this chapter, I cannot be the missing letter in the scroll. I can give no simpler answer, nor do I know of a more powerful one, right? But it's a very personal answer that he gives there, right? He's not really telling us how each of us should live. That's got to be on us, right? And that's autonomy, right? It's on us to come to that conclusion that we will not be the missing letter in the scroll. And that's what we have to communicate to young people, right? To the next generation. And a lot of them feel it in some very deep and real way, but as educators, I mean, that becomes our responsibility, is to continue to pass that on so that they'll answer it the way I answer it, the way you answer it, the way Rabbi Sacks answers it. I will not be the missing letter, right? You know, someone else may be a missing letter, that's their business. I will not be a missing letter in the scroll, right? And that, I think, is as he says, he doesn't know of a more powerful answer to the question, right? And that's chapters 3 and 4. So, so read on if you haven't. Read chapters 5 and 6 for next week, the second part of the book. So part 2, the journey, right, is where we're headed next. So thanks very much for being here today. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for piping up and joining in the discussion. I hope I didn't miss too many faces. It's, you know, when we're on 2 screens, it's hard to see everybody, but I hope you all have a good rest of the afternoon and evening, and we'll see you soon. For those of you who are interested in movies, we start part 2 of Real Jewish Classics tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So I invite you to come back for that discussion tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Really
My pleasure. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
It's really special. Thank you.